Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our latest Legal Cheek virtual student event. I'm Juliet Griffiths, Head of Student Engagement here at Legal Cheek, and I'm very excited to introduce this afternoon's session, which is the final event in this year's SQE themed series we're running in partnership with BPP University Law School. If you haven't seen any of the previous events in the series, please don't worry. They're all available to watch in full on our website. So the introduction of the SQE a few years ago has, as I'm sure many of you know, brought about many significant changes to the process of qualifying as a solicitor, one of which is the introduction of qualifying work experience, or QWE, which is an alternative to the traditional training contract pathway. I'm sure that Johnny's going to go into this in much more depth, but I thought I'd just give a slight intro there. So during today's session, we're going to be delving into how, where, and when to acquire QWE, as well as covering some of your most frequently asked questions. So speaking of which, you can find yet more information about the SQE on our SQE FAQs page, which features answers to the most frequently asked questions written by BPP's SQE experts. My colleague is just going to post a link to this page in the chat in a moment, so you can all go and have a look at it at some point. Moving on to this afternoon's event, I'm delighted to introduce BPP's Head of Outreach and former City Law Firm partner, Johnny Hurst, who will be hosting today's session. Johnny's also going to be joined in just a moment by Casey, Chloe, and Henry, who are all at various stages of their SQE and QWE journeys, and they're going to share more about their different experiences shortly. So in a moment, I'm going to drop off stage and hand over to Johnny to introduce himself and the other panelists. But firstly, I'm just going to very quickly explain how this afternoon's event will work. For the next hour, we're going to be hearing from BPP all about QWE. At 5 p.m, I'll pop back up on stage and direct everyone to the expo for an hour of virtual networking, which is the perfect opportunity to ask all your burning questions. During this panel discussion on stage, you can ask your questions as we go along in the chat, which is located on the right-hand side of your screen. But we would recommend holding on to these until the networking, as we've got quite a packed schedule, so we may not get round to them until the networking. So when you are asking your questions, please make sure that you've got your chat set to stage as opposed to event, so that we can see your questions as they come through. And without any further ado, I'm going to hand straight over to Johnny.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Juliet. Well, I'm delighted to be back here again to be talking more about the SQE, and in particular how to get qualifying work experience, which is the training period that is associated with the SQE pathway to qualify as a solicitor. There's a bunch of slides here that I'm going to rattle through, and I'll just give you a bit of an overview before we introduce our very special student guests. So the agenda for the session, well, we're going to introduce you to what the SQE is, and then we'll talk about what QWE, qualifying work experience, is. And then what we'll do is take a number of questions that have been asked in advance by the Legal Cheek audience, so that we can address exactly what people in the room want to answer. I do like doing these sessions because we get questions from you guys in advance, and I always try and answer anything that's on theme, that's raised in advance. We'll try our best to do all the other questions that come up on the chat, but remember, in the second hour, anything that doesn't get asked, and that may well be most of the stuff that you might want to ask on the chat, we'll certainly be able to cover in that second hour. Very briefly, in terms of what the SQE is, and I know that when people attend these sessions, they are at different stages of their learning journey and their awareness of what SQE is and what qualifying work experience is. So very briefly, just going through this little flowchart here. The SQE is the pathway to qualify as a solicitor. You need a degree to be able to go on the SQE pathway. If you're a non-law graduate, certainly BPP recommends strongly that you really need a very strong and well covered law foundation course, law conversion course, or PGDL as it's often called, not one that only takes 4 or 5 weeks. That literally won't get you to where you need to get to. You need to do a good 5 or 6 month course if you're a non-law graduate before you embark on the SQE route. But if you're an LLB graduate, then you can go straight onto the SQE, and you would take SQE Part 1, which we'll show you in a minute, then SQE Part 2. And at some stage during your journey, you have to pick up what we're covering today, qualifying work experience. In fact, you can do your qualifying work experience before you do the SQE exams, during the time when you're doing the SQE exams, or afterwards. Or you can combine bits and pieces of QWE before, during, and afterwards. It's very flexible in terms of how you accrue your 2 years worth of qualifying work experience. And you have to pass the satisfactory character and suitability test to be admitted as a solicitor. So that tells you where in the whole sort of journey qualifying work experience sits, but it's not necessarily that linear journey as you can see on the screen there. That's certainly the traditional route that students would do their degree, then they do their solicitors exams, then they do their vocational work experience, a training contract in old speak, or qualifying work experience now. But as I said a moment ago, you can do your QWE before, during, or after your SQE studies. So before we introduce you to our fantastic panel, just to very briefly, just to give you some background as to what the SQE is. It is set into two different parts, SQE1 and SQE2. SQE1 consists of two multiple choice papers. They are 360 multiple choice questions across the two papers. What you can see in white there are the subjects that you would study pretty much on any law degree you have in the land, or you need to make sure you study them. Occasionally, one or two of these are options, but in most law degrees, they're all compulsory. We expect you to have that knowledge when you come to join us for an SQE course, because we then teach you all the rest of the content of the syllabus, which is the practice-based subjects. And you sit those 360 multiple choice questions in separate papers across consecutive weeks. You do 90 questions in the morning, 90 in the afternoon 1 week, and then you do the same in paper 2 the following week. You've got 1 minute 42 on average to answer each question, so it's pretty full on. You need to have a really good test prep course that's really established, I would say, by a reputable provider with a strong pass rate to give you the confidence that you're putting your money in a place that is well invested. You then, if you pass SQE1, you move on to SQE2, which is learning a bunch of practical skills to prepare you for the assessments. There are 4 oral assessments and 12 skills assessments, written skills assessments. And half of the marks for these assessments are on the skill itself, but the other half is for demonstrating your understanding and application of the relevant law. So you have to take forward the law that you've learned from SQE1 and put it into practice in SQE2. Anyway, we're not going to spend any time talking about this now because we've covered this in other sessions that we've done with Legal Chic. And just to say, we're delighted to continue to update. We've just updated all of the FAQs that are on the website that Legal Chic host, so that it should answer the vast majority of your questions. But if something does crop up that hasn't been asked before, we will add it to those FAQs. Right, so this is the stage where I'll be joined by our special guest today. So without further ado, if I could invite, please, Henry, if you could tell us a little bit about your background, where you are on your SQE and QWE journey.
Sure, yeah. Thanks, Johnny. As Johnny says, my name's Henry. I'm currently in the last 6 weeks of my 2 years QWE. I've completed my QWE through a company called AccuTrainee, who are somewhat of an innovative training provider in that they take candidates on who would like to complete 2 years QWE, and they send you out to different companies in kind of usually 6 months, although it can be longer chunks. So you get to complete your 2 years at a range of companies, different industries, different sized firms, both private practice and in-house. So that's where I am in terms of my qualification journey. I also took the SQE route. I could have elected to do either LPC or SQE, but chose the SQE. So yeah, happy to answer any questions on SQE, QWE, and yeah, good to be here with you all.
Great stuff. Have you managed to pass the exams, or are you still part of the way through?
I've passed number one, and my SQE2 results come out at the end of August, which also mirrors or marries up with my 2 years ending. So It's either going to be
Fingers
a very
crossed.
good end to
Fingers
the month
crossed on that.
or
Just before we go on to Casey and Chloe, perhaps we could just explore the model for your QWE a little bit more, because a number of people won't be familiar with AccuTrainee. I'll just put the name in the chat so people can see it. AccuTrainee is, as you've said, a very innovative organisation when it comes to sorting out qualifying work experience. They're not a law firm, but they employ you, don't they? And then they second you, or you get seconded by employers, and that can be for how long? How long is typically the placement you might get, or does it vary?
Yeah, they are typically 6 months, which kind of mirrors a traditional training contract in that you do 4 chunks of 6 months in different seats, if you will, but those seats are different businesses, different law firms. So it was in existence before the SQE route came out, but it really does marry up very well with the SQE route to qualification, and the concept of QWE. So yeah, they've been brilliant. They help take a lot of the burden off of keeping work logs. They have a platform that they allow their trainees to use to track all of your progress and keep up to date with what kind of competencies you're meeting
Oh, we lost you a
in
bit.
your placements. So um, can you hear me? Okay, sorry.
Oh, yeah. Sorry, I
Yeah.
wasn't sure whether it was your internet went out or mine, but we lost you for a moment, or I did certainly. Great stuff. So
Okay.
it's a very flexible way that you can get experience across multiple businesses, which you wouldn't do if you were doing a conventional 2-year training contract at a single firm. So you can get different practice areas, but also different practice areas at different firms, which is great. And just to reiterate for everyone's benefit, so you understand how QWE works, you have to accrue 2 years of QWE, and you can do so in up to 4 employers. So which employers have you worked at during that period? So do you just want to run through, because I think you mentioned a couple to me when we spoke earlier.
Yeah, so I wasn't the typical AccuTrainee in that I worked in an in-house legal team before going to AccuTrainee. So I worked for a company called LiveScore Group, who wanted to train me. I was a paralegal there for a number of years beforehand, and they engaged AccuTrainee to kind of take me on that qualification journey. So I've worked for LiveScore for 3 of my 4 seats, if you want to call them seats, and also a firm called CMS, which are in Cannon Street in the city, for anyone who knows it.
So what sort of practice areas have you managed to get experience of?
Yeah, it's a great question. So my time at CMS was spent in commercial litigation, which was working primarily on kind of breach of contract claims. Spent some time in the High Court, which was really interesting and engaging. Got to see some cases arguing in court, which was a real eye opener. So yeah, all litigation whilst at CMS, and then in house, it's been a mix of some regulatory work, being LiveScore Group do a lot of online gambling. So there's obviously a very heavily regulated industry, lots of license conditions and codes of practice to contend with, as well as some corporate work, some investment pieces, some kind of raising private equity investments, and also a lot of commercial contracts, which is a kind of big part of an in-house role typically. So yeah, those are the kind of 4 main areas. But part of the joy of working in-house is that you kind of get a lot of different things thrown at you from time to time. So there's lots of other little pieces in there of other more kind of niche areas that I've touched on.
Great stuff. Great stuff. Well, thank you for that, Henry. Let's go over to Casey now. And before I say, Casey, you're not a King's Counsel, just to be really clear on that. But you've got a fantastic name. It's Kletchy, isn't it? But you prefer to go by Casey. Lovely to have you again today. You've worked with us in so many different sessions before, and you've always got an amazing insight into the nature of the work that you do, which is so different to what Henry does. So tell us where you are on your journey and what you're doing.
So my name's Casey, as Johnny said. I'm employed by an advice agency called Limehouse Project, which is based in Tower Hamlets. So they mostly deal with just generalist advice, typically with welfare benefits, housing, generalist debt, and a bit of immigration and employment. But for the purposes of the qualifying work experience, I'm also with a company called the Legal Advice Centre in Bethnal Green, and they deal with housing law, family law, immigration law, employment law, and a bit of welfare benefits. So over there, I'm mostly dealing with welfare benefit matters at the moment, specifically assisting clients with mandatory reconsiderations and submitting appeals for the tribunals, and assisting representation at the tribunal stage as well. So at the moment, I've been doing that since the start of my apprenticeship, which started last year in September. So I'm only in my first year. I haven't yet reached the SQE stage, but I should be doing that next year. And have asked to change to another area of law. So I should be doing family law, hopefully commencing from September.
Brilliant. And how long is your apprenticeship? Because we say that the qualifying work experience has to be 2 years, but apprenticeships tend to be a bit longer, don't they?
Yes. So the rough scale they kind of said for the apprenticeship duration is about 3 years. But I think that's kind of give or take depending if you have any resits for the exams or how long everything takes. I'm due to sit my SQE1 next year in June, if all goes well, and SQE2 hopefully either October or January. So depending how they go, if I qualify in time, then I should be done by the end of next year. So it should be 2 years roughly.
Great stuff. So for everyone, very different to what Henry's doing. That Casey is actually, although working in practice, not doing strictly qualifying work experience, but in lieu of qualifying work experience, an apprenticeship contract is something that delivers the same outcomes. How does it work in terms of your studies? Because I presume you need to be released on day release, do you?
Yes. So I do 1 day a week, which is my Mondays, and then Tuesday to Fridays when I'm doing my qualifying work experience. So Mondays with BPP, I do an online workshop. It's 2 hours from 1:30 to 3:30. But even though it's just those 2 hours that's online with the lecturer, obviously you have to still use the whole day, and of course your evenings and sometimes weekends to do your own studying and your own, self-reading and research.
Cool. Brilliant. Excellent. So not yet sat an SQE assessment, as opposed to Henry, who's been through SQE1. And finally, on to Chloe, who has come out the other side, haven't you, Chloe?
I have. So I think I took a little bit of a different approach to Henry and Casey. I decided to complete my SQE1 and SQE2 before I did qualifying work experience. And I'm very happy to say that they are in the past. I completed both of them successfully last year. And I'm sure Henry, come August, is going to be a fantastic result. So I hope that all goes well. After I finished my SQE1 and 2, I got a placement with the BPP Legal Advice Clinic for a 6-month QWE stint. And it's something that's only offered to BPP students. You also have to have volunteered in the clinic while studying with BPP. And it's a fabulous experience. I think it's quite similar actually to what Casey's doing. We do a lot of housing law, a lot of welfare benefits, family, commercial, and enterprise. And I do quite a bit. I personally do housing at the moment, and my supervising solicitor seems to have thrown me into litigation and into the county court, which is going well at the moment. It's a bit nerve-wracking, but it's a lot of fun.
Fabulous. So you've got one of the 6 paid QWE placements that BPP reserves for its SQE graduates. So congratulations on securing that. And we'll talk a little bit more about how you managed to do that a little bit later on. Okay, so obviously you're all in paid placements at the moment. There is a question, if we could just show that up, Saad, maybe we could just, the one at 413 from Precious, if you could just get that on the screen, that'd be great for us. And Precious asked, does the employment have to be a paid employment, or can it be unpaid employment? Well, the answer is it can strictly be paid or unpaid, but you have to ask yourself, well, unless you're working in the voluntary sector, say working for a legal advice clinic who can't afford to hire you, we wouldn't want you to be working in private practice for nothing. That's not ideal from your own career perspective. You really should be seeking paid work. But strictly speaking, if you did work for nothing and you did work that amounted to QWE, it is certainly capable of counting, provided you can have it signed off. And just to be clear, when it comes to QWE, you need it signed off by a solicitor who's qualified in England and Wales, or the compliance officer for legal practice at the firm or business that you're working for. And if you can't do that, there are some intermediary organizations that will sign it off for you. There's a template as to how to record your QWE that's on the SRA's website, that if anybody's in the middle or going into QWE, certainly recommend you look at that beforehand and then keep a record of what you're doing, so that it's much easier for everyone to sign off when the time comes. Okay, let's get cracking then with the fantastic questions that we've had in advance from this audience. So let me see if I can go and get back my slides. Here we go. So first question, well, what qualifies as qualifying work experience under the SQE route? That was from a student from the University of Leicester. I'll deal with the first few questions before we bring back our fantastic panel, because they're fairly general. So it's really important that the label doesn't matter. So it could be legal clerk. It could even be a legal secretary. It depends what you are doing. It's not the label, it's the work you do. So just doing admin, even if it says paralegal and all you do is admin, that will not count. You need to be working towards what we call the solicitor competencies. And these are published on the SRA's website, but typically these competencies are things like interviewing clients, advising clients, attending court, giving advice to clients, writing letters, or negotiating with representatives on the other side, and so on. What it doesn't include is admin work, photocopying, pure support, pure secretarial work. But it might be that some legal secretarial work would amount to QWE if you're doing fee earning work, working as a fee earner within a law firm or within a business. So it's very important that you just go by what the work is rather than you go by what the label is to the role that you will be doing. Hopefully that answers that question. The next one that came up was, does QWE have to be consecutive, or can you work for a year, do something else, and then resume it? I think we've answered that already for the student from Oxford Brookes, but yes, you can do it before, during, or after, or mix and match it as you go through your SQE journey. So very flexible. It's one of the benefits of the new system. This question from Raw Holloway: when would you recommend completing your QWE? Before, during, or after your SQE qualification? Well, let's throw this open to the panel. You've all obviously gone through different processes. I mean, Chloe, you decided that you would just bite the bullet and get the exams out the way first. What was your thinking behind that?
I think I just wanted to compartmentalize the stress. I thought, I was a recent LLB graduate, so I was in the mindset of studying and a student. And I thought, personally, for me, it would be best to continue that mindset while I was in it. It would depend really on your own personal capacity and how you like to study and work. But for me, it was definitely the better of the options. And now that I am doing qualifying work experience, I can put the stress of the exams out my mind. Yeah, it's quite a privileged position. I do recognize that. It was nice to get done.
Yeah, and I think one of the reasons why a lot of people take the route that Chloe did, but it's not for everyone, and go straight into the SQE straight from university, is because the knowledge that you have from your university undergraduate law degree is still stuff that you need to know for the SQE. And obviously, the further away from your original studies you get, the harder it is to recall and the harder it is to get back up to speed with it. And you've got to remember, subjects like contract are typically taught in your first year. You're having to get back on top of that 4+ years later by the time the exam comes in most cases. So it's a factor to take into account, but not necessarily the only one. Casey, tell us about your decision to get an apprenticeship and therefore study as earn and learn at the same time, which may well be the answer to why you decided to take that route.
Yeah, so I guess partially earn and learn, but I think also as well, what's beneficial for me is being able to kind of put in the practice alongside what I'm learning. So I think it kind of helps not only with the portfolio that we're doing, which has to kind of demonstrate what we are doing in the work field, but also being able to put into practice the stuff that I'm learning. So it helps to stick in my mind a lot better. I'm typically a visual learner, so I think being able to do the qualifying work experience alongside my studies, it helps it to stick in my mind a lot better and be able to kind of revise as I go along. So I find that kind of works a lot better for me.
Yeah, experiential learning. So
Yeah.
learn through your own experience, which of course,
Yeah.
if you're advising clients now, when it comes to SQE2, you'll be all over that like a rash. It could be so easy. You could do it standing on your head. Absolutely. Brilliant. And Henry, what took you to your chosen method?
Yeah, so I was in a career as a paralegal when I got the opportunity to start my training. So for me, the kind of demands of the employer I had was, it made it not really an option to kind of drop out from work and focus just on studying. But um, I would say having worked full time and done the SQE 1 and 2 whilst maintaining work commitments, I think SQE 1 is I think, like you alluded to, Johnny, best done as close to your studies as possible. I think it is very knowledge heavy, SQE 1, and probably doesn't need you to be in work to really have a strong chance at passing. It is very focused on kind of the more academic knowledge side. SQE2, however, I think is the opposite. It tests your legal skills a lot more than it does your knowledge. And actually, being in legal work, I felt gave me a bit of an advantage when taking the SQE2 exams, because certain examinations they'll have you do, like drafting research notes and doing kind of client interviews. I'd done them at work previously, so I had a bit of exposure to how they work, and had a bit of experience going into the exam. So yeah, for me it was kind of not really an option to not work and do it, but I haven't regretted it. I found it manageable whilst working and studying. So yeah.
Sure. And just to see, there are some questions that have come up, and we'll try and answer one or two of them that are relevant here. So if we could have Pamela's at 4:13, that'd be really helpful. Interested to know how many hours a week do you? I think this is for Casey. Is it 2 years? Oh, actually, it might be just generically. Is that 2 years full time? I think that's just generically talking about QWE. Yes, it's QWE. That figure of 2 years is if you're working full time. Obviously, full time is deemed to be somewhere in the region of 35 to 40 hours a week. There's not a fixed number of hours there, but clearly if you're working 2 or 3 days a week, then what the SRA have said when I've asked is that you have to effectively show that you've done the equivalent of 2 years qualifying work experience. So if you work 20 hours a week for 4 years, then you probably would accrue your 2 years qualifying work experience equivalent. Maybe slightly quicker than that, because I think a working week is less than 40 hours typically. Hopefully that answers your question there, Pamela. Let's skip on if we can do, because there's loads more questions that people have asked. So how does QWE differ from a training contract? Let me just put this into context. The word training contract is very much a legacy term from the old LPC, which was 2 years at a single law firm that you took, and you did immediately after your LPC if you could get the training contract straight after. But the term a training contract is still used in the QWE route quite loosely to mean a 2-year period of QWE at a single law firm. But some people even talk about it as, you could all, Henry's period in his placement could be regarded to be a short training contract that forms part of his QWE. So it's quite a sort of flexible term. But I think what the critical thing is, I think what's behind this question is, how does it differ from, say, an old LPC training contract? And one of the main differences is that you do not have to do seat rotation in a number of different practice areas, which you did do under an LPC training contract. You had to do at least one litigious seat. In other words, one seat in some sort of litigation department or dispute resolution department. You don't have to do that under the SQE regime. In fact, you could work for the same department for the whole of the 2 years if you really want to. But that's not to be recommended unless you really know that that is where you want to end up. Okay, let's skip on to the next question. What are the benefits of an apprenticeship over that of a training contract? So Casey, so you've got this apprenticeship, and it's great because it's quite unusually flexed over more than one employer. Obviously, the training contract, if it's sponsored, you get paid, and you get paid for this. But how do you view that as being more beneficial to you in terms of doing the apprenticeship?
For me personally, I feel like because I have, well, for me, I suppose, like you said, it's different because I've got 2 different employers. So I'm getting 2 different types of work experience. I think the apprenticeship is slightly more beneficial because, like I said before, you get to do your training side as well as do your learning, so you can apply what you're learning to your physical side, your qualifying work experience, which is more beneficial. I know obviously some people prefer it differently, like what Chloe said earlier. She preferred to get it over and done with first and then do the training afterwards. But for me, like I said, I prefer to do them both at the same time because it's easier to apply it as you go along. And I've got quite good management and support system to be able to help me to understand things and learn on the job as I go.
Brilliant. Yeah, and I think what we need to emphasize is that the typical training contract for 2 years at one single firm normally comes after the whole period of education. Indeed, a lot of the big city firms send people on their SQE studies for 2 years before they start their 2-year QW or 2-year training contract. So for you to be able to earn and learn at the same time gives you that ability to learn on the job, which those candidates wouldn't do. I think another significance and one benefit is that Casey, you never would have got a paid training opportunity under the old LPC regime like this, because there is something called the apprenticeship levy, which is effectively a tax paid by employers. Employers can draw down on that to pay for Casey's training, and therefore what we're finding is many employers, many small employers, many public sector employers are sending people like Casey just to train whilst they are in apprenticeships, which they never would have done under the old LPC regime.
Yeah.
Great stuff. So let's go and have a look at the next question. What are the prospects of securing an NQ job after qualifying through the SQ route with QWE in comparison to a standard training contract? Maybe if I could bring in Henry here. So you are about to qualify. How do you feel you're placed, having done 18 months or so, or possibly more, with one employer, then 6 months in the city with CMS? So two very different types of roles. How do you feel you are placed in the employment market going into roles, or were you going to stay with one of those employers?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I am lucky enough to have been offered an NQ role at LiveScore, the company that I'm currently doing my last 6 months at. So I'm fortunate in that respect, and I guess reflecting on that, I haven't felt like it's held me back necessarily. I think there's certainly advantages of it that you can emphasize to employers. If you've had a varied 2 years, in my case, going in both in-house and private practice, that can actually make you quite an attractive candidate. It can make you stand out from trainees who perhaps have just spent 2 years at one firm, moving around, only ever working in private practice. So I don't think it I don't think it necessarily holds you back. I think it's obviously a very broad question and will depend kind of what your career ambitions are. If you're looking to kind of end up at, a really top tier Magic Circle-esque firm in the city, they're naturally extremely competitive anyways, and maybe tend to look in-house for, or in within their own trainee cohorts for NQ roles. But if you're looking at a more kind of wider market of places that you might want to work at, I definitely don't think it will hold you back at all.
Excellent, and I think I think that's right. I think it depends on the work that you get. So the actual model is fine, depending on the work you get, but you need to align it to the type of lawyer you want to be. There's no point working in sector A, B, and C if you want to end up in sector X, Y, or Z. You have to try and align it. Otherwise, nobody will want to employ you in something that you've got very little, if any, experience in.
Yeah.
And so that's the key. And also, I think, as Henry mentioned, if you do aspire to working in the city, you need to have some like a secondment, like with CMS, that you've got at the very minimum, if you are doing this sort of portfolio style QWE. We could go and we could discuss this question until the cows come home, because it's quite a detailed question, but hopefully that gives you a bit of a flavour to why that is a very important question, a very good one, and things to be thinking about going forward on it. Okay, well, this is one for you, Chloe. What was the application process for qualifying work experience at BPP? So just before Chloe answers this question, just to for those who didn't come to the session on time, we at BPP offer 5 paid 6-month placements of qualifying work experience in our social impact team. No other provider of legal education provides such an opportunity. There are other providers that provide a few weeks here and there, but that's just the equivalent of working in our social impacting whilst you're a student and won't really accrue to very much qualifying work experience, and it's very unlikely to count at the end of the day. But what Chloe's doing, like Henry, is building up a chunk of work of 6 months that will go towards the ultimate 2 years to qualify. So what was the application process then, Chloe? What did you, how come you got it and others didn't?
So to be able to even put in your application, you have to be obviously a BPP student, and you have to have previously volunteered at the advice clinic before. So that then makes you eligible. You can put in essentially your cover letter, CV, kind of the standard first round. Actually, no, sorry, I'm lying. You put in kind of your interest, then they invite you to give in your CV. Then after that, you are sent. It's a bit like an assessment day, I guess, but you do it at home. You get sent a whole bunch of tasks essentially to do that would probably take you the whole day. And then if you get past that round, you are invited to a final interview with 2 clinic managers. So it is quite a process, but I think like any legal job, they're all processes. It's just something that we have to be okay with in this field. So
That's
yeah.
right. Perfect. And just to emphasize, and you've heard already from Chloe and from Casey that both are working in sectors in social welfare type sectors or legal advice type scenarios amongst the portfolio of work they do. And that really then answers Rianne's question from 421. If we could just get that up, Rianne's question: does CAB, Citizens Advice Bureau work count towards QWE? Well, if you are being given the opportunity to work towards the solicitor competencies, so if you're advising clients or doing legal research to support lawyers to go appear in court, or, working towards those solicitor competencies, or be given the opportunity to take those opportunity to develop those competencies, then you will be carrying out QWE. And it doesn't matter whether it's paid or not. So voluntary work is capable of counting, certainly. And therefore, working at a clinic at your university in theory might count, but in practice, I don't want to overstate the likelihood that any work that anybody does at their undergraduate university in their legal clinic is likely to count. It probably will only amount to a few hours here and there by the time you aggregate it. So bearing in mind, you've got to work for 2 years full-time equivalent for your QWE and up to 4 employers. If in fact your voluntary work at your university's legal advice clinic only amounts to a couple of weeks, in practice it's never going to count because you're going to accrue much more elsewhere. Okay, let's move on because we have loads more great questions from you, and there's so many in the chat as well, which please do make sure that you've copied your question to your clipboard, by the way, because there are many I've read in the chat. I think I've got to answer that, but we won't have time to answer it. Stay on at 5 o'clock and we will answer the rest, but make sure you copied your question onto your clipboard so you can copy and paste it into the chat when we go into the breakout room in about 20 minutes time. So this question from a student from King's College, London: what are examples of QW pathways which could take besides working within a law firm? Well, I think we have several examples already from our fantastic panel here, but there's also working in the public sector. We've got many students who are now doing solicitor apprenticeships, working in the public sector, whether it's the Ministry of Justice or for local councils or the Government Legal Service. You could be working at small companies, in-house, in large or small companies, as well as in law firms. So there is no particular limitations. And in particular, answering one question that did come up in the chat, international work as a lawyer in a different jurisdiction is also capable of counting. You do not have to be practicing English law for the work to count as QWE, but you still have to have it signed off by somebody who is a qualified lawyer or the compliance officer for legal practice, or go through one of these intermediaries. And to answer Andrew Michael's question that was raised at 425, the intermediaries who can sign off will still need to interrogate you quite a lot and speak to the people that you work with to be satisfied that your work has ticked all the boxes in your developing the key solicitor competencies. So there are independent organizations that have set up. Some charge a very large fee, and I'm not recommending any of them because I think there are some that are doing a better job than others. But you can, if you're struggling to get your QW signed off, particularly if you're working outside private practice or maybe working internationally, there are these organizations. But if they're US qualified in this case and not qualified in England and Wales, you're going to have to find somebody either that you've worked with, either in the firm or maybe work with in practice, or go to one of these intermediary organizations that do advertise their services out there. Okay, Andrew, hopefully that answered your question. Let's go on and look at the next question from the Legal Chic audience that was sent in advance. Can you provide specific examples of how to effectively build a QWE portfolio when working for multiple employers, and what are the challenges that students might face in this process? So this is really for Henry and Chloe, I think. Let's bring in maybe Chloe first, because you'll be finishing your QWE with BPP, that 6-month stint. What are you looking at in terms of what's your strategy in terms of how you're going to build up the rest of your QWE portfolio?
So I've thought about this for a long time, and to be completely honest to all the students listening, I haven't actually got a very clear answer for you, which I think is quite normal. I'm approaching it more with kind of an open mind. I do know the type of law that I want to get experience in, which is kind of the social sector. I haven't completely ruled out anything commercial wise, but the more I work, the more I'm thinking, in terms of a private law firm is maybe not for me. I think when you work in the social welfare sector, they don't really recruit, for example, 2 years in advance. So it's a little bit not easier. Well, maybe easier in some respect. You don't have to think about your life 2 years ahead of you, but you kind of can do your applications a little bit closer to the time. So obviously, I've got a few. I can't really say at the moment because nothing's been confirmed, but there are opportunities that I'm looking at the moment. But I'm kind of staying within this sector and just being really on top of my research. I guess that would be my best tip to everyone. You really need to be on top of your research and look at what these places require you to have.
And it's building up a picture about yourself, your brand, basically. And if you're somebody who's dedicated to social welfare and are starting to create that in your portfolio, then it's probably easier to get the second, third stint once you've got one under your belt, I would have thought, in that regard. Henry, do you want to give us a bit of an insight in terms of when you're the challenges that people might face in building up this portfolio? I mean, there was a question that came in earlier from I think it was Toledo at 424, because you did mention you did paralegal work, which in theory should, depending on what you do, could count as QWE. But did the first bit of work not count as QWE for you?
Yeah, no, it's a good question. So when I sat down with my boss, the general counsel at Life School, we decided that it would be best for me to have a kind of dedicated 2 years of training, which was geared towards me learning the skills that you would need as an NQ. So it's not necessarily that my paralegal work wouldn't have counted. It was more of a kind of conscious decision to take a whole 2 year stint as a trainee. But I think it goes back to what you said earlier, Johnny. It really just depends on the kind of quality of work that you're doing. If you're engaged in kind of real solid legal work as a paralegal, then from what I've seen, that should count towards your QWE. On the kind of point of building up a portfolio, I guess I can give you two kind of different answers aimed at different aspects of that. So, in terms of getting placements, I was quite fortunate in that I worked as a paralegal before, and Live Score then took me on as a trainee. So that's obviously a route that you can take if you are happy to kind of start off as a paralegal, impress from within, and then kind of use that as a route to then getting QWE. Um, and then more on kind of a practical aspect in terms of keeping a log of the work you're doing, which is quite important as you are completing your QWE. So I use a platform that AccuTrainee provide us. It's actually called Pathways, funnily enough. So that allows us. It's an online platform, and it gives us one kind of consolidated place to keep a log of all the competencies that we're meeting. So I believe the SRA have a list of competencies that they want you to be meeting whilst you're doing your QWE, and it also allows you to kind of keep dates of when you've done things and keep a log of kind of what work you've been doing and what skills you've learned throughout it. you could quite easily replicate that platform in a kind of Excel or even just some sort of OneNote on Microsoft, if you have that software on your personal laptop. But it's just really important to, as you're doing work, keep track of what tasks you've done, what you've learned from them, and how that's kind of meeting the competencies that the SRA have listed out, which I believe you can find on the SRA website for anyone who's interested.
Definitely. And I think that's one of the challenges, particularly if you've maybe done paralegal work for a while and then looking at qualifying, trying to retrospectively build up your log is so much more difficult than if you're doing it contemporaneously. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Great. Lots more questions. Is it necessary to gain QWE in different practice areas like the seats in a training contract? I think we've answered that already. That strictly speaking, you could do one seat or just work in one department for the whole of the 2 years, but unless you are dedicated to that particular practice area and you know that's all you want to do, then I'd caution you against it. But of course, it's something that if you've been a paralegal for many years in a particular department and don't want to move, then that's absolutely fine. But I think if you're straight out of university and then thinking, what do I want to do? Try things, try different practice areas. You don't know what you don't know. And law firms, graduate recruitment teams tell me all the time that people reluctantly take a seat in whatever department it is, and they end up deciding that's where they want to qualify because they didn't realize that it would be so interesting and so much fun. So try and get as wide experience as you can in your QWE. It's not a sprint to clock up the 2 years. It's actually about quality more than it is about quantity. And in that regard, I think the point that Henry made a moment ago, don't think just because you got 2 years or 6 months or 12 months that your next employer isn't going to turn around like Henry's employer and said, we want to actually design and put you through a whole 2-year training program. You don't have a right to say, I insist you only train me for 18 months. If that's what the employer wants, and most employers of a mid-size or above might decide to do that unless you've done a stint or two in places that they're happy to consider to give you credit for. It just depends on a case-by-case basis. Okay. Do potential employers prefer candidates who have completed their QWE with more or fewer organisations? What do you think? I'll go back to sort of Henry and Chloe. We'll bring in Casey here for the next question. Apologies, Casey. These seem to be orientated to those who are trying to build up their QWE, whereas yours, of course, your 2-year period is sorted out for you. But although actually, I could start off with you, Casey. Having worked for more than one employer, do you think that puts you in a better position or a worse position?
I think probably, but I'd say better. Might be a little biased, but I think a bit better because I have different experience from different employers. So, for example, with Limehouse, even though it's only generalist advice and doesn't really cover legal, it still has transferable skills that help me to set up for my qualifying work experience with the Legal Advice Centre. And then obviously Legal Advice Centre, it's more adapted and more the legal version of what I do at Limehouse. So I think it really does help. And because of they're both different types of environments, obviously the Legal Advice Centre is a bit more serious, obviously, and especially in types of the work we do with the clients. I think having that environment and then having a bit more of like I'd say a bit more of a relaxed environment with Limehouse Project. It's nice to have different types of backgrounds with both and different types of experience with both. And it also opens me up to working with a different type of clientele. There's a lot more of like a communal feel with the clients that I have. A lot of them are from the Bangladeshi community in Tower Hamlets. And then whereas Legal Advice Centre, because we can also deal with clients outside of Tower Hamlets, all the way down to South London, even as far as Cornwall, we're open to a lot more of a different type of clients that we get, not just the Tower Hamlets community itself. So I think it does help to have a variety of experience from both employers.
I'm going to take it as read that that's the same answer with Chloe and Henry because we've got so many more questions to get through. Is it possible or realistic to undertake QW abroad? If you've got any tips, I'm French German grad and would like to gain international experience. Absolutely, I've said it already. QWE can be undertaken. You can be seconded. A big firm might second you for an international seat, but it is possible for you to work for a non-English firm outside the jurisdiction as long as your QWE can be signed off in the way that we've described earlier. Can you start accumulating your QW while studying for your LLB? in theory, yes. In practice, you probably won't be at the level where you're actually being given the opportunity to develop those competencies because you won't have enough of a legal background. So in theory, yes. I suppose if you're working on a part-time, working part-time whilst studying, or part-time as well, an LLB, it may well be that you build yourself up in a paralegal role where you do have competencies that are at the level of a trainee, but it's very unlikely for somebody as an undergraduate working alongside being an undergraduate as a full-time undergraduate that you're likely to be actually accruing what is QWE, even though you might work in a law firm part-time. Most entry-level paralegal jobs require experience. How do I overcome that, having just finished university? So what's your top tip then, guys, to getting some work experience in the legal sector? Let's start off with Chloe.
Volunteer. I think that might be the similar answer to what everyone else will give. There's quite a few places out there that will consider taking on volunteer work, and they do citizens advice, for example. While you're at BPP, if you come to BPP, please volunteer for the legal advice clinic. We're great, and you get really great experience. Really, just do your research and find some volunteer roles.
Yeah, there are hundreds and hundreds of roles at BPP, but also other legal advice centres that are associated with other providers as well. I would also add that I think I mentioned it earlier, but I probably didn't articulate it in enough detail. Just getting your foot in the door with a law firm, whether it's as a receptionist or a secretary, is half the battle. And once they realise that you are somebody who is interested in a career as a practicing lawyer, you'll be given work in no time. Honestly, there are so many jobs and opportunities that come available in pretty much any law firm or any law organisation in the country. They won't mourn the fact that you were originally a receptionist. Receptionists are easier to hire. It's harder to find people who are good people who want to be lawyers. And if they like you and they want to give you a chance to cut your teeth, then why not? So get in there in whatever shape or form you can in a paid role, even if it's not a law paid role. That's the other tip I would say. Right, some top tips. Is it better to self-fund the SQE and build a QW portfolio at multiple employers, or get sponsored at a single employer? Well, I suppose if you don't have to pay any money yourself, getting sponsored is pretty cool, or getting an apprenticeship. I think that's probably a bit of a no-brainer. So we'll move on from that. A second, I've just gone back. Let's go to this one. This is a good one. What activities would you recommend students take part in when they're trying to build up their commercial awareness and employability skills? So whilst you are an undergraduate university, getting ready for the working world, Henry, what are your tips that for students to be doing to make them career ready, interview ready?
Yeah, it's a great question, and a commercial awareness is a term that gets banded around a lot. I'm going to give you maybe some advice you've heard before, and it's nothing groundbreaking, but read the news, be engaged in what's going on in the world. If you have a particular industry that you're looking to kind of break into, whether that's private practice or in-house, know what's going on in that industry, know what's on the horizon for businesses in that space, and be able to talk to it in a good level of detail if asked. And that's definitely helped me in my journey.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of people say or think they should be reading the Financial Times, which is, yeah, for most undergraduates is probably a step too far. At some stage, you might be able to, but certainly just engaging in current affairs and the legal business. Read, Legal Chic is a great website to find out what's going on. It's the articles are of interest to the student community, both in practice but also in practice areas as well. Read the Law Society Gazette, The Lawyer, if your university subscribes to it. There are plenty of places for you to get knowledge to build up your commercial awareness of different legal sectors, as well as the business of law as well, which is important from an employability perspective. How can you make your applications for training contracts or paralegal positions stand out? So I suppose, why did you guys all get hired? What was it in the process you think that made you got hired? What was your top tip then, Casey?
So for me, I had volunteer experience, which helped me get employed by Limehouse Project. So I think that was one thing that kind of stood out for them with me, because I had a bit of experience in terms of dealing with clients and in some of the sectors that they deal with, such as welfare benefits, a bit of employment, housing, things like that. And then I would say the other thing is also just being honest and also specifying what it is that I'm looking for in the company and in experience, as well as what would be suitable for them, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it's a two-way process, and I think a lot of people forget about that. Everyone who's employing just thinks, well, I think I'll be lucky for anyone to employ me. Actually, they will be very lucky to employ you if you're any good, and therefore, you need to be saying, well, what do you want, and making it clear. I think that's an important thing, and it can make it look like that you know what you want and you know your mind, and that's a conversation a lot of law firms would be quite happy to have. Excellent. Chloe, how did you make your application stand out? Or I suppose going forward for other roles, obviously it sounds like you've got a few things maybe in the pipeline. Apart from obviously citing your great work experience you've got now, what else do you think makes you stand out as a candidate?
I think this is maybe something everyone's heard before, but really try and put some effort into your applications. I know they can be quite long and a bit tedious, but do your research on the firm and look at what cases they're working on, or law centre, I guess, not necessarily firm. Look at what they're working on, look at what interests them, and ask yourself, does this interest me? Because if you come across as inauthentic, they're probably going to pick that up. So say to yourself, does this interest me? Yes. Okay, cool. Let's read more about it and put that into your application. Show that you are very eager and that this is a place that you think you could fit in.
Yeah, great tip that in terms of certainly in the commercial sector, or not even the commercial sector. Yeah, if you've got a firm that's had a case reported in the legal press, or you can see references on the website to client deals that have gone through, or anything in the financial or other press that's involved the firm, research it. And if it's relevant and you're interested in it, refer to it during the process. It might not be appropriate in writing, but you might get yourself to an interview. And when they say, why this firm, you can say, well, I've been doing some research in this firm and I saw that you represented so and so on this area of law. It was fascinating. It made me go and want to do some research myself, blah, blah, blah. And before you know it, they're offering you a training contract because you've gone to that extra mile. And it makes such a difference. How about you, Henry? What's your tip? How did you make your application stand out?
Yeah, but mine's slightly unusual in that I obviously worked as a paralegal at the company that took me on to train me. So I had a kind of 2-year long interview, if you want to look at it that way, whilst I was a
Well,
paralegal.
before though, I mean, you obviously before you got the job, even as a paralegal, how did you
Yeah,
make your application to stand out then?
yeah, great question. So I think with law being so competitive, it's very tempting to kind of try and mold your application to say what you want, what you think the firm wants from you. And I think actually, there is a need to do a bit of that, but also just really don't be afraid to kind of express yourself and give them an idea of who you are. Um, that is the way to stand out. I think that they'll see a ton of applications that probably all look very similar because people are
Yeah,
just trying to kind of say what they think the firm wants to hear. So actually, putting a bit of personality into your applications, I think will get you a
that's
long way.
a great tip. I have read so many applications that basically could have been written by hundreds of people. Make your application look unique. Give them your own unique answer. Make sure they know something about you that nobody else could say, because it will stand out. Um, and don't copy and paste your last application either. You need to make it firm specific. So, final few questions before we tip round to the hour mark. Any tips on how to balance studying the SQE whilst gaining QWE? I think that's one for both Casey and Henry. Casey, how did you manage? How do you manage?
I would say you have to be very diligent, very focused. I know it's kind of cliche and very obvious, but learning how to keep your work separate from your study days. So at first I found this very difficult to juggle. Like I'd be tempted to log into my work emails and just check them through on my uni days, which was really bad. And then obviously it does get my study time. I think also if you make like a uni timetable, so like I've made one, so obviously Mondays is my typical uni day, of course, but even in the evenings, if you maybe plan like an extra couple of hours after you finish work, or on the weekends, maybe on a Saturday, and then you can rest on the Sunday, or delegating like a couple of hours to be able to do a bit of study time and sort out what you're going to focus on, and also prep in advance for the next week. And then and I think also in work, just being able to speak to your managers as well about your workload, so that you're not overwhelmed in terms of all your drafting and workload that you have to do there, so that it's not too much and doesn't take your focus off your studies completely, but that you're still getting enough qualifying work experience for the purposes of the apprenticeship or SQ.
Yeah. And managing your workload is absolutely essential. You're
Yes.
going to be under a lot of pressure with your studies. You're going to be a lot of pressure on work, and you need to give people realistic expectations as to how much you can do, and that you're not available on a Monday because that's your study day. Absolutely. Can you share some examples of non-traditional, unique forms of work experience that would be beneficial for aspiring solicitors? Well, what sort of work experience do you guys do that you maybe brought into the interview process? Is anyone who wants to jump in? I'll just take one example for anyone who wants to jump in. So something that isn't, say, working in the legal sector. Is there a role? I mean, all roles have transferable skills. Is there anyone in particular that perhaps you would have mentioned? Any of you? Feel free to jump in.
I worked in a outbound sales role straight out of university, and
Oh yeah,
although I didn't quite I can't say I enjoyed it, but I think certainly there's skills that, like you say, Johnny, are transferable, and it does allow you to kind of speak to commercial awareness in a way that potentially someone who's kind of always worked on the legal side might be able to. So not recommending it. It's a tough job, but yeah,
yeah.
if you want to move
I think
up,
I think that's a really good point. And the point is, every job has transferable skills. Everyone on this call, I would think, with bar maybe one or two, have worked in some such sort of employment. Ask yourself, what did I learn? What skills did I acquire? Who did I meet? If it was a business, think about the business, because that will start to give you and develop your commercial awareness more. And think about how they were working from a financial perspective, amongst other things, and that will help to demonstrate in the interview process, if you have to show commercial awareness, that you were engaged in the nature of the organization you're working in, not just turning up and doing the job and going home again. Wow, we have clocked round to the hour mark. I was going to show you our fantastic pass rates for the SQE. That's 20% above the national average across all cohorts. You probably knew that already. And for SQE2, 17% above for these two cohorts here. So we're doing incredibly well for our SQE, and it's the highest pass rates that I'm aware that any provider has published. So we're very proud of that. And testing point in a few of our trainees or graduates are on display today. Before we go, just to remind you, we are going to be answering questions in the breakout room, which I now will invite Legal Cheek to come back in. But I think this is the point where we say goodbye to Henry, because you're free to go. I think you needed to go on the hour, don't you, Henry? Thank you so much.
I am actually on holiday. Yes, I'm on
Yes,
annual leave,
exactly.
so I'm gonna
You go.
thank you for your time and leave you. Yeah, thanks
Thank
for
you.
having me.
Thank you so much. And you've done a fantastic job. Many, many questions brilliantly answered. Thank you so much.
Cheers. Bye-bye.
Cheers. Juliet, do you want to give the stage directions for where we go for the second half?
Yes, fabulous. Thank you so much, Johnny, and to Casey and to Henry, who's just left, and Chloe as well. You all shared some really wonderful insights there. I think everyone has seen, and as Johnny's mentioned, there have been reams and reams of questions coming through in the chat, which unfortunately not had time to get to during this hour. But if you could just copy the questions that you've been posting in the chat and take them over to the expo in the left-hand sidebar, there'll be a booth in there where you can talk to Johnny, Casey, and Chloe, and you can ask all of those questions. So for those in the audience, if you just head over there now, and speakers will be heading over there very shortly. Another thing I quickly wanted to reiterate is, if you've got any more general questions about the SQE or QWE that you want to sort of revisit after this session, make sure to check out our SQE FAQ We've got dozens of questions up there with answers written by BPP's SQE experts on a whole wide range of different topics. So it's a great opportunity to go and just find out more in your own time. So I'd like to say another massive thank you to our speakers. If you just hold on for a few moments, once we end the broadcast, we'll direct you to the networking. But for everyone else, feel free to head over to Expo on the left-hand sidebar now, and we'll see you all there. And thank you again for joining today's event. And we hope to see you at the next one. Thank you.